Massachusetts. Winter, 2019. Rain slid slowly down the window of a small studio apartment in Cambridge, leaving long trembling lines across the glass. Outside, the sky was the color of cold steel. Inside, the room smelled faintly of oil paint and turpentine. James Mitchell stood by the window, watching the rain. He was 39 years old, thin, pale, the kind of man who carried exhaustion quietly in his shoulders. His hands were the hands of an artist, long fingers stained with pigment, nails edged with blue and umber from countless hours at the easel. But those hands were empty. On the small kitchen table beside him lay a stack of envelopes. Electric bill, water bill, 2 months of unpaid rent. Late notices printed in sharp red letters that seemed to scream without making a sound. James had already sold almost everything worth selling. The television was gone. The comfortable couch he once loved had disappeared weeks earlier. Even several old paintings, works he had once kept for sentimental reasons, had been sold for far less than they deserved. Still, it wasn't enough. That morning the landlord had called. His voice had been polite, but firm. "Mr. Mitchell," he had said, "if the rent isn't paid by Friday, I'll have to take measures." Measures. Such a careful word for eviction. James rubbed his face with both hands. He wasn't just tired. This was a deeper kind of exhaustion, the kind that builds slowly over years of trying, failing, trying again. There had been a time when things looked different. Years ago, galleries had returned his calls. Collectors had shown interest in his work. A small exhibition in Boston had even brought him modest recognition. But the art world had a short memory. And recently, it seemed to have forgotten him completely. Now the galleries didn't answer. Emails went unread. Phone calls ended with polite excuses. James still painted. Of course he did. Painting was the only language his hands truly understood. But passion alone didn't pay rent. It didn't buy groceries. And it certainly didn't silence the stack of bills growing heavier by the day. Over the past months, James had tried everything. He had sent resumes, applied for temporary jobs, even considered giving up painting altogether and finding what people like to call a normal job. But every time he imagined abandoning the canvas, something inside him resisted. Painting wasn't just work. It was who he was. And now, somehow, he was losing even that. James had never believed in God. Not out of anger. Not because of tragedy. He simply never saw a reason to. To him, the universe was just what it appeared to be: matter, time, coincidence. No divine plan. No celestial intervention. When people spoke about miracles, answered prayers, or signs from heaven, James would listen politely. But inside, he remained unconvinced. Religion, in his mind, was tradition. A cultural story people told themselves to soften the fear of uncertainty. Nothing more. So when life became difficult, when bills piled up and loneliness pressed in from every corner, James didn't pray. He didn't ask heaven for help. Because as far as he was concerned, there was no one listening. That gray afternoon the rain continued tapping gently against the window. James stood in the quiet studio and stared at the envelopes on the table. Failure had a strange weight. You couldn't see it, but it filled the room all the same. He looked down at his hands again. Hands that could create beauty. Hands capable of painting light and shadow in ways that once impressed strangers. And yet, they couldn't solve the simplest problem in front of him. They couldn't pay the bills. James sighed. And just as he did, the phone rang. The sound startled him. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello." A woman's voice spoke softly on the other end. Careful, measured, as if every word mattered. "Mr. Mitchell?" "Yes," he replied. "This is James." "My name is Margaret Williams," the voice said. "I recently saw several of your paintings in a small gallery in Boston." James blinked in surprise. It had been months since anyone mentioned his work. "I was deeply moved by the way you paint light," she continued gently. For a moment, James didn't know what to say. "Thank you," he finally replied. There was a brief pause. Then Margaret spoke again. "Mr. Mitchell, I would like to commission a painting." James immediately reached for the small notebook on his table. Any job, absolutely any job, was welcome now. "Of course," he said quickly. "What did you have in mind?" Margaret hesitated. James could almost hear her breathing on the other side of the line. Finally, she said the words. "I would like you to paint the Virgin Mary." James' pencil froze halfway across the page. The Virgin Mary. Something tightened in his chest. He couldn't quite explain why. Margaret continued speaking. It's for our community church, she said. It's small and humble, but it's where I've worshipped for more than 40 years. Her voice softened. It's where I married my husband. A pause. And where I buried him. James listened quietly. I recently received a small inheritance, she continued. Nothing extravagant, but enough to do something meaningful. And I realized something, Mr. Mitchell. What's that? He asked. That money isn't meant to sit quietly in a bank account. It should become something that lasts. Something that touches people. She inhaled slowly. I want the church to have something beautiful. Something that reminds people they're not alone. Then she said the number. I can offer $48,000 for the painting. James didn't speak. For several seconds, he simply stood there holding the phone. 48,000. The number echoed in his mind. That amount could change everything. The rent. The bills. New paints. A chance to breathe again. But something else lingered in the room. A strange feeling. As if accepting the job meant stepping through a door that couldn't be closed again. Because painting the Virgin Mary meant something very specific. It meant painting faith. And James Mitchell didn't believe in faith. Mr. Mitchell? Margaret asked gently. Are you still there? James looked down at his hands. Hands that needed to work. Hands that needed to survive. Faith didn't pay the bills. Reality did. He took a slow breath. I'll do it, he said. Margaret exhaled with relief. Oh, Mr. Mitchell, you have no idea how much this means to me. Then she added something quietly. There's only one thing I ask. James waited. I want her to look alive. He frowned slightly. As if she's truly there, Margaret continued. As if her eyes see every person who enters the church. As if someone broken or tired could look at her and feel watched over. James wrote her words down carefully, but they felt heavier than ordinary instructions. When the call ended, he stood alone in the silent studio. Hands that didn't believe. Were about to paint something sacred. And for reasons he couldn't explain, a faint shiver passed down his spine. As if something unseen had quietly entered the room. At first, James tried to explain it away. When he painted, the pain in his wrist vanished. When he stopped, it returned. Simple as that. He tested it more than once. The old ache, sharp, familiar, stubborn, had lived in his right wrist for months. Years of holding brushes, years of repetition, had worn the joint down until even lifting a coffee cup sometimes caused discomfort. But now something impossible seemed to be happening. The pain disappeared every time he stood before the canvas. Not faded, not softened, disappeared. The moment he set the brush down, it came back. Sharp, immediate, as if someone had turned it off and on. James frowned and flexed his hand again. Then he picked up the brush and returned to the blue mantle of the Virgin. The ache vanished instantly. He froze. For a moment he simply stood there, brush suspended in the air. Then he said aloud, to no one but himself. Coincidence. He swallowed. It has to be coincidence. But something quiet inside him, some small part of him he was trying very hard not to hear, was no longer so certain. The next day, around noon, James stood in front of the canvas mixing paint. He was trying to find the exact blue Margaret had described without describing it. Not too bright, not too cold. Something between cobalt and the color of sky just before twilight. A blue that suggested peace. A blue that could hold sorrow without becoming sadness. He was studying the mixture when the light appeared. Not sunlight. Not a reflection from a passing car. Something else. A bluish light. Soft. Luminous. Almost alive. It came through the studio window and fell directly across the canvas. Only the canvas. Not the floor. Not the table. Not the walls. The painting alone. James stopped breathing for a second. He slowly turned his head toward the window. The sky outside was completely overcast. Dense gray cloud from horizon to horizon. No break in the weather. No sunlight anywhere. He turned back to the canvas. The light remained. A pale blue glow pulsing very gently, as if breathing. James stared at it, his heart beginning to race. He set the palette down and crossed quickly to the window, searching for some explanation. A piece of glass. A reflected sign. A neighbor's windshield. Anything. There was nothing. When he looked back, the light was still there. Exactly where it had been. Illuminating the Virgin. 3 minutes later, it disappeared. Not gradually. Not fading. It simply ceased. As if it had never existed at all. James stood motionless in the center of the studio. His breathing had grown shallow. His hands trembled just enough for him to notice. This, he whispered, This isn't possible. But it had happened. He had seen it. And no matter how hard he tried to reason with himself, the truth remained exactly where he had left it. On the canvas. In that impossible blue light. A week later, on a Sunday night, the second thing happened. James was working late again. The studio was quiet. Windows closed. No television. No music. Only the soft sound of the brush moving across canvas. He was refining the line of the Virgin's cheek when he noticed the scent. Roses. Not faint. Not imagined. A rich, unmistakable fragrance. Fresh roses. Intense and sweet and completely out of place. James stopped painting at once. He lifted his head and inhaled. There was no question. Roses. He walked slowly around the studio. Looked under the table. Opened cabinets. Checked the trash bin. Even stepped into the hallway outside his apartment. Nothing. No flowers. No perfume. No open window through which the scent might have drifted. And yet the fragrance continued filling the room. It didn't sit lightly in the air. It surrounded him. Soft. Beautiful. Impossible to ignore. He stood in the center of the studio, turning in place, trying to think rationally. Maybe a neighbor had flowers. Maybe the scent had entered earlier and lingered. Maybe stress was affecting him more than he realized. The roses remained for nearly 10 minutes. Then, just as suddenly as they had come, they were gone. No fading. No trace. The room returned to its usual smell of paint, canvas, and wet winter air. James sank onto the studio floor and dragged both hands across his face. It's stress, he muttered. Fatigue. That's all. But his voice sounded weak. Almost embarrassed. Because deep down, something in him already knew that explanation did not satisfy what he had just experienced. Stress did not create blue light on canvas. Fatigue did not fill locked rooms with the scent of roses. And for the first time in his life, James felt something he had rarely allowed himself to feel. Not fear of danger, but fear of mystery. The following Monday, he made a doctor's appointment. If his body was betraying him, he wanted facts. The wrist pain worried him less now than the possibility that something else was wrong. Neurological issues. Stress-induced hallucinations. Something explainable. Something medical. The doctor examined his wrist. Ordered blood work. Ran an X-ray. A week later, James sat in the office again while the doctor flipped through the results. Finally, the man looked up and said, "Mr. Mitchell, everything is normal." James blinked. "What do you mean normal?" "Your wrist is fine," the doctor said. "There's no structural damage. No inflammation. No visible injury." "But I've had pain for months," James insisted. The doctor shrugged slightly. "Sometimes the body heals on its own. It may have been mild tendinitis. It happens." James left the office in silence. He reached his car, opened the door, sat behind the wheel, and did nothing. He didn't start the engine. He simply sat there with both hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, James felt genuinely shaken. Not by something violent, not by something threatening, but by something beyond his control. Something that touched the edge of everything he had always dismissed. After that, he worked harder than ever. Obsessively. He woke early. He painted late into the night. Sometimes he forgot to eat. Sometimes he slept only a few hours before returning to the canvas. The painting consumed him. Not like a commission. Not like money. Not even like ambition. It consumed him like a question that would not stop asking itself. There was something inside the work now. Something that would not let him leave it unfinished. And yet, no matter how much he painted, one part still resisted him. The face. The mantle was right. The hands were delicate. The folds of the robe carried weight and softness exactly as he wanted. But the face remained empty. Technically beautiful. Emotionally dead. Margaret's words haunted him. "I want her to look alive." James painted and erased. Painted again. Adjusted proportions. Changed the direction of the eyes. Softened the mouth. Every version failed. He was an accomplished portraitist. He knew how to create expression. He knew how to build humanity through line and shadow. But this time his skill was not enough. And that frightened him more than he wanted to admit. Then came the night everything changed. It was a Wednesday at the end of March. Winter was loosening its grip, but only slightly. The air outside still carried the bitterness of the season. Inside the studio, James was alone. He had been working quietly on the cloak, refining highlights and shadows, when the cold arrived. Not ordinary cold. Not the draft from a poorly sealed window. This was different. Sudden. Intense. A chill that seemed to move through the room from nowhere and enter directly into his bones. James lowered the brush and looked around. The windows were shut. The radiator was on. But the cold grew stronger. He rubbed his arms. Then his eyes moved to the clock on the wall. The second hand had stopped. Exactly at 9:47 p.m. James stared at it, then looked at his own hands. They were shaking. Not from temperature. From something deeper. Anticipation. Fear. The feeling that reality itself had become unstable. The air in the room felt strange now. Still. Suspended. As if time had stepped aside and left the space waiting. And then the roses returned. Stronger than before. Not merely present now, but overwhelming. Rich. Sweet. Filled with life. James' heart was pounding so hard, he could feel it in his throat. "What is happening?" he whispered. Then he looked at the canvas. And the blue light appeared again. But this time it was not soft. Not delicate. It came from the center of the painting and expanded outward, filling the studio with living color. It was brighter now. Deeper. Not just illumination. Presence. James stepped backward once. Then again. Then again. His legs had begun to weaken beneath him. The light intensified. And then, she appeared. Not on the canvas. Not as pigment and brushwork. There. In the center of the room. Alive. The Virgin Mary stood within the light. Her garments were blue and white, moving gently as if stirred by a breeze James could not feel. Her face held a serenity beyond anything he had ever seen in life or art. But it was her eyes that undid him. Eyes filled with compassion so complete that James felt every hidden wound inside him suddenly exposed and loved. Not judged. Not condemned. Seen. Understood. Held. She did not speak. She didn't need to. Her presence said everything words could never contain. James wanted to ask questions. Wanted to understand. Wanted to know if what he was seeing was real. But no sound came from him. Only tears. Silent. Unstoppable. Time no longer seemed measurable. It may have been seconds. It may have been far longer. James would never know. All he knew was that the emptiness he had carried for years, the cold disbelief, the quiet loneliness, the certainty that nothing waited beyond what could be measured, had been broken open in an instant. And in its place was something else. Peace. Love. A vast and impossible tenderness. Then, slowly, gently, the light began to soften. The figure faded. The blue glow withdrew back into the painting. And the room was silent again. James fell to his knees. Not from choice. His legs simply gave way beneath him. He stayed there, tears running down his face, unable to move. These were not tears of sorrow, nor even joy. They were tears of recognition. Something inside him had been changed. Permanently. The universe was no longer what he had believed it to be. He was no longer who he had been that morning. When at last he stood again, he turned toward the canvas. And for the first time since beginning the commission, he knew exactly how to paint the face. Because now he had seen it. For the first time in his life, James Mitchell felt something unfamiliar. Gratitude. Not for money. Not for success. But for being chosen. 2 weeks later, Margaret Williams returned to the studio. James had called the day before. The painting was finished. Saturday morning sunlight finally broke through the long stretch of gray winter skies. The light entered the studio gently, warming the wooden floor and the unfinished canvases leaning against the walls. When Margaret stepped inside, James stood beside the large canvas. It was covered by a white cloth. "Mr. Mitchell," Margaret said with a soft smile. "Mrs. Williams," he replied. For a moment, neither of them spoke. James took a breath. "There's something I need to tell you before I show it," he said quietly. Margaret watched him carefully. "When I accepted this commission," he continued, "I didn't believe in any of this." He hesitated. Faith, miracles, God. To me it was all just tradition. Stories people told themselves. His voice lowered slightly. "But something happened while I was painting." Margaret said nothing. "I can't explain it," James admitted. "And I'm not asking you to believe me." He glanced at the covered canvas. "But this painting, it isn't only mine." Margaret's expression softened, almost as if she had been expecting those words. "May I see it?" she asked gently. James nodded. Slowly, he lifted the cloth. Margaret gasped softly. Her hand rose instinctively to her chest. Tears filled her eyes before she even stepped closer. She walked slowly toward the canvas. One step, then another. Then she stopped. For several long moments, she said nothing at all. She simply looked at the calm face of the Virgin, at the hands folded in quiet prayer, at the soft blue mantle flowing around her shoulders. But most of all, at the eyes that seemed to meet the gaze of anyone who stood before them. Not staring, not judging, simply seeing, understanding. Margaret's tears rolled silently down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. A minute passed, then 2, then 3. Finally she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's exactly as I dreamed." She turned slowly toward James. "Exactly." James felt his throat tighten. Margaret stepped toward him and gently took his hands in hers. Her hands were old, but strong. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for accepting this." James nodded quietly, because now he understood something he hadn't before. Margaret hadn't found him by accident. The commission hadn't been coincidence. None of it had. The following week the painting was installed in the small community church Margaret had described. James did not attend the inauguration, not because he didn't want to, but because he felt the moment did not belong to him. It belonged to Margaret, to the congregation, to the people who had believed long before he ever did. But 3 days later, Margaret called him. "Mr. Mitchell," she said softly, "I need to tell you something." "What is it?" James asked. Her voice trembled with emotion. "People feel something when they enter the church." James didn't respond. "They stand in front of the painting," she continued, "and many of them begin to cry. Others remain silent for a long time. But they all say the same thing." Margaret paused. "They say they don't feel alone anymore." James closed his eyes. Warmth spread slowly through his chest. Margaret continued. "An elderly woman who lost her son 2 years ago stood in front of the painting for almost an hour. When she left, she said that for the first time since his death, she felt peace." Margaret's voice grew softer. "A young man came into the church yesterday. He told me he had been thinking about ending his life. He stood before the painting for a few minutes. And then he said it felt like someone was telling him, 'Don't give up.'" Margaret inhaled slowly. "I don't know what you did, Mr. Mitchell, but you didn't just paint an image. You opened a door." James could not answer. He simply stood there holding the phone. And when the call ended, he remained still for a long time, looking at his hands. The same hands that once believed in nothing. Hands that now knew they had touched something sacred, and had been touched by it. James continued painting, but never in the same way again. Something inside him had changed. Not his technique, not his skill, but the intention behind every brushstroke. Each canvas now carried something different, something quieter, a sense of reverence, a respect for what existed beyond what the eyes could see. James never spoke publicly about what had happened that night. He didn't try to convince anyone. He didn't try to prove anything, because he had understood something essential. Faith cannot be explained. Faith must be lived. The studio itself remained the same. Same walls, same window, same afternoon light filtering through the glass. But James was no longer the same man who had stood there months earlier staring at unpaid bills. Now he woke earlier each morning. Before painting, he would sit quietly for a few minutes, doing nothing, just breathing, giving thanks. For the day, for his hands, for the strange and fragile gift of life. He had never done that before, but now it felt natural. From time to time, people began visiting the studio. Some came because someone recommended him. Others seemed to arrive almost mysteriously. One afternoon, a young woman knocked on the door. Her eyes were red from crying. "I saw the painting in the church," she said quietly, "and someone told me you painted it." James nodded. "I did." She hesitated. "I was wondering if you could paint something for me." James invited her inside. She told him about the loss she carried, about grief, about the loneliness that had followed. "When I looked at that painting," she said through tears, "I felt like I wasn't alone anymore. And I need to feel that again on the days when it's hardest." James listened. Then he simply said, "I will paint it for you." It wasn't just work anymore. It had become something else. A calling. Sometimes, late at night, when the city was quiet, James returned to the studio. He would sit in the same chair where he had sat the night everything changed, and look at the place where the light had appeared, where she had stood. He never expected it to happen again. He never asked for another sign. But he no longer needed one. Because now he knew something he had never known before. He was not alone. And he never had been. One Sunday morning, months later, James decided to visit the church. He didn't tell anyone. He simply walked in quietly through the side door. The building was nearly empty. A few people sat scattered across the wooden pews in silent prayer. James walked slowly down the aisle. Then he saw it. The painting. It hung along the side wall, illuminated by soft morning light from a nearby window. James stopped and looked at the face he had painted, at the eyes that seemed alive, at the hands folded gently in prayer. His chest tightened, not with sadness, with gratitude. An elderly woman sat in the front pew looking at the painting. James quietly sat several benches behind her. The woman remained there for a long time. Eventually she stood. Before leaving, she gently touched the edge of the frame and whispered softly, "Thank you for being here." James felt tears rise in his eyes. She wasn't thanking the painting. She was thanking the one the painting represented. And in that moment, James understood something deeply important. He hadn't simply painted an image. He had been an instrument of something far greater than himself. James left the church quietly. Outside, the sun filled the streets with warm light. People walked past. Cars moved. Life continued. But he was different. Not because he had witnessed something extraordinary, but because he had allowed himself to be seen. And once seen, everything changes. Sometimes the sacred does not arrive with thunder or blinding light. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the life of an ordinary man, through a blank canvas, through the faith of another, through a love he never expected to encounter. James Mitchell never searched for God, but God found him anyway, through paint, through light, through a painting that now hung quietly on a church wall. And once known, that love could never be forgotten. If this story touched your heart, write in the comments. Thank you, Virgin Mary. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe to the channel so more stories like this can reach people who need hope today. Until the next story, be at peace.